Lady Leonora Harborough's drawing room had been disarranged with the most elaborate care. A microphone stood, with an air of apologetic impudence, between two century-old cabinets. A plate-glass screen, new, exact, and clinical, sliced the room as a modernist might have sliced a canvas. The Aubusson rug had been lifted from the center and rolled like a minor diploma against the wall. On the mantel-shelf, caught in the lamplight, an array of Venetian goblets lifted their green stems and punted bowls into the soft air. They were arranged with the assured negligence of the practiced collector. "Mr. Foyle," said Lady Leonora, letting her rings make the faintest, purest sound upon the edge of the plate glass. "Will your men be very long? I find it makes one whisper in one's own head." Basil Foyle, an earnest man with a competent forehead and a rather harried tie, glanced at the glass and then at the two men busy with their spools and boxes in the annex that was ordinarily a music room. "Just a moment, Lady Leonora. Mr. Priest is testing for rumble. One wouldn't think your street could manage it, but omnibuses are ambitious." "Everything is ambitious in Queen Street," said Lady Leonora, with the mild malice of the perfectly secure. She inclined her head slightly to the company. "We are to be curious and considerate," she added to the room. "Curiosity under control has been described to me as civilization." "It has also been described to me as boredom," murmured Lionel Vane. He had stationed himself as if by instinct in the light. His face took it gratefully. He was one of those fortunate actors who, upon reaching the most modest of platforms, is instantly a stage. "But I'm sure," he added with a bow to his hostess that almost managed to be humble, "we shall avoid both extremes." "Lionel," said a young lady at the French window without looking at him, "you will make Mr. Foyle dread his profession." The young lady was Miss Iris Harborough, Lady Leonora's stepdaughter. She stood half within the room and half without it, grey satin and pale fronded lilies behind her making an agreeable design. There was a rumour, which had the persistence of an impolite truth, that she had wished to read for the National Talking Library herself. But it was Lionel Vane whose name was to bring cheques from discreet purses. Her face, seen in profile, was obediently beautiful. Mr. Priest, who was the engineer in a dark suit and an unromantic heart, lifted his hand, watched the needles steady, and permitted himself, just once, to look across at the goblets that made their ghostly light. He did not know them, but he knew their fragility, and disliked them as any practical man dislikes a broken morning. "Levels," he said, and Mr. Foyle scampered obediently. Sir Felix Davenant had attached himself to the goblets already, as a moth attaches itself to a lamp and possibly to its own destruction. He hovered before the cabinets, the plump fineness of his hand hovering an inch from a wine bottle, green rumour with its nubbly trails. "Lady Leonora," he observed, in a voice composed entirely of appreciation, "how sly of you. You've taken in the novice with a tranche of genuine 17th century and a nearly persuasive 20th. May one." "You may look," said Lady Leonora, "and you may say things that I shall repeat to those who prefer to be taken in, but do not touch. Gibbons will touch for you if touching becomes necessary." The butler, Gibbons, who had entered with a tray and achieved the soundless minor miracle of putting it down without acknowledging the contrivances in the room, inclined his head. He was one of those men who, having climbed from footman to sovereign control, neither obscure their knowledge nor display it. He looked at Sir Felix as one looks at a child near a precipice, and then looked at nothing at all. Sir Felix bent nearer. "Your Raymer is deliciously vulgar," he murmured. "This one now, façon de Venise clearly, but with a foot that wants to be English. Do you know that little feathering? No, don't be alarmed, I won't. There, this sort of stress mark in the bowl. It makes the most heart-breaking note when tapped. It sings as if it knew." "Felix," said Lady Leonora, "you sentimentalize the inanimate. That is why your wives have always left you." "They have left me," said Sir Felix without rancour, "because I prefer objects that do not lie." Lionel Vane laughed softly, and then, because the engineer had begun to frown in the way of men for whom frowning is a professional instrument, he stopped laughing. He stepped into the little enclosure of the glass. His reflection stepped in with him and was unusually sincere. "You will have water, Mr. Vane," said Basil Foyle in a voice that was solicitous and unbossy. "Gibbons has put honey and lemon by the stool. Mr. Preece asks that you do not clear your throat into the microphone. He cannot be father to everything." "Darling Basil," said Lionel, "I have never cleared my throat. I was born with it cleared." He regarded the carafe and its companion tumbler with what, in any other man, would have been calculation. In him it was unstudied ritual. He would drink without looking, would put it down without seeing, would touch the honey with a little silver spoon while speaking of modesty. "It is a fine contrivance," said Mrs. Honoria Brant, who wore more jewelry than etiquette proposed, but less than she believed. She consented to be excited by the notion of recording a human voice for the benefit of those who could not see. "One speaks and it is preserved. To be preserved is a delicious idea." "If one has said anything worth preserving," said Iris Harborough. "Oh, my dear," said Mrs. Brant, "your generation believes it says everything worth preserving. It is adorable." "Mrs. Brant," murmured Lady Leonora, "you are my penance." The door at the far end opened again, and Henry Tord came in. There was an orderly arrangement of time and handwriting about Henry that made one think of a country grammar school, of a scholarship, of a fortunate, unadmitted beauty. He moved well. He was Lady Leonora's secretary. He kept her life neat and her engagements softer than they sounded. He went up to her, bent slightly, and spoke at a level that admitted secrecy only as grace. "Mrs. Deans asks if the supper may be kept in the cooler, my lady. Mr. Preece says that heat is an enemy." "Then cool it," said Lady Leonora, "and offer it later as a reconciliation." She added, "Henry, the little Venetian with the twisted stem, did I dream or did Mr. Varelli say there was a weakness?" Henry's face did not alter. Mr. Varelli thought the stem had been overfired. He observed a flaw, but said it was harmless if no one insisted upon demonstrating physics at table. "Physics," said Sir Felix from the cabinet, in the shape of a teaspoon. "Gibbons," said Lady Leonora pleasantly, "be ungenerous with teaspoons." "Very good, my lady." Lionel, inside his glass, made a slight bow to nobody in particular and leaned on the high stool. He had a page in his hand and put it down. He had an instinct for making prosaic objects look as if they had been carved for him. "We are to begin with the first chapter?" he asked. Basil Foyle came up against the glass and spoke to him as through a window. "With the preface," he said apologetically. "The librarian thought it would tether the listeners. You are very kind to give us the preface." "At my age," said Lionel, "I am kind as a vice." He glanced over the lines again and half smiled. "It is always the preface that upsets somebody." "Very well, Mr. Preece. Silence me." Gibbons, with the husbandry of the well-trained, was erasing the more conspicuous glasses from the tables. He did not touch those in the cabinet. He removed a shallow dish that had contained lemon halves, but now contained only insistence. As he took up a cut-glass tumbler from the wing of a chair and tilted it slightly to avoid the clot of light near its base, Sir Felix's attention, wandering away from virtue, came to rest upon Gibbons' courteous hand. He smiled at the hand. It was a hand that had polished glass before the owner of the glass had known it existed. "It will be, then," said Mr. Preece into the wrong side of his mouth. "Take one." The faint burr of the turntable deepened and sat down in the corner like a well-mannered dog. Lionel's voice, in its first movement, became a creature of wires. It reached them through the loudspeaker with an odd intimacy, as if it had put its head round the door and said what it pleased to say. "This book," said Lionel, "owes more than its existence to my wife. If it has any grace, she must be thanked for, insisting that I write as if conversing with an old friend." Iris Harborough looked down. Her mouth formed the word friend as if she were balancing it. Lady Leonora did not move, and not as if explaining my virtues to an indifferent stranger. Lionel lifted his eyes from the page at the little joke, and in the booth his profile became, with weary obedience, noble. Mrs. Brant breathed. "He is perfect. How impossible for a machine to know that." "The machine does not know it," said Basil Foyle. "It is the machine's most charming quality." At the far edge of the room, where the lamplight thinned into the hall, there was a slight incident, the sort of incident that would not have mattered in any other room. A door opened a little and closed again without making a remark. Someone stood for a second in that thin light and was then tidied away by it. Henry glanced up, but in Henry, glances were economical and could be overlooked. Gibbons had noticed nothing and everything. "The glass of our lives," said Lionel, "if one may be permitted to say so, is not like the window that looks on the garden, nor like the bowl that catches rain. It is more, perhaps, like the mirror, with its dangerous flattery, and like a wine-glass cracked so subtly one thinks the taste is at fault." Sir Felix chuckled inaudibly and touched the air again with his abolished finger. Basil Foyle, listening and at the same time not listening, because he was counting seconds and silences, made a little note to cut the sentence if necessary. Preece steadied the levels and looked as if he had married them. "You are very pale," Mrs. Brant whispered to Iris. "It becomes you. Is it the heat?" "I am well," Iris said. "One does not feel heat when one is being improved." "Improved?" Mrs. Brant stared. "By Lionel, but of course, yes. I meant by circumstance." Lady Leonora's foot, invisible under the long line of her gown, had made the least movement. It made one think of a cat's tail. "Henry," she said without turning her head, "will you telephone to Brigadier Lethbridge and say we shall read the passage he marked when that first hour is done? He is impatient in the old way." "Yes, my lady." Henry went to the writing table, lifted the receiver, and obtained, by the quiet method, a complacent exchange. He spoke, and in speaking made the little silence around him change shape. Lionel's voice inside the glass lowered and became something like regret. It had in it the exact degree of valor. The room had fallen still, not only because stillness was asked, but because silence is contagious when dressed well. The only small sound was the infinitesimal protest of a moth at a large lampshade and the barely audible conversation of wax and wick. Sir Felix, without touching the glass, leaned nearer. One of the Venetian goblets had caught a deeper tone of lamplight, which emphasized a flaw he had seen before and treated as one treats a past indiscretion. It was the twist in the stem that Mr. Varelli had deplored. He smiled his mild, acquisitive smile at it. It seemed to smile back. Gibbons moved with the patience of someone who will not be hurried by someone else's excitement and stood for a moment by the edge of the plate glass screen. If one had looked closely, and it would not have been done, one would have seen a scarcely visible smear at a height that answered to a shoulder. But nobody looked closely because Lionel was saying quietly, "And if a man cannot bear looking at himself clearly, he may always shatter the glass." "Delicious coincidence," Mrs. Brant breathed. Basil Foyle lifted his head. He had the manager's instinct for the untimely. "We'll go on to the letter, Mr. Vane, if you please," he said, not through the microphone, but with that peculiar projection that artists recognize as respect. He gestured to the page. Lionel did not take it. He had begun to read the letter already, with that grave ease which makes a man seem to have written it before the writer had thought of it. Iris turned her head slightly. Through the French window the garden had darkened into theory. Somewhere at the bottom of it, a cat made the asocial sound that cats make when they disagree about property. It was half comic and wholly indecorous. She closed the window with an economical hand. "Gibbons," said Lady Leonora, her voice at that rich low level that makes instruction and intimacy, "when Mr. Vane has read the letter, bring the 1640 Roma to Sir Felix. He must have his physics." "Yes, my lady." "You will be responsible," she added. "I'm always responsible, my lady." said Gibbons. Basil Foyle glanced at her quickly. There was in her tone the slightest register of, constraint, amusement. It withdrew even as one asked the question. Lionel's voice ran on. Heads tilted, the needles wavered fractionally, and the room, a room of veneered tact and old money turned into habit, seemed to hold its breath not because it was excited, but because it had been told to. Only in the cabinet, under a lifted wing of light, a hair-thin gleam traced itself along the throat of a glass, as though a pale thing had brushed past and asked the object to remember. Sir Felix did not see it. Gibbons might have seen it. Iris did not look. Lady Leonora's foot was still, and Mr. Preece, who believed in the physics of sound and the virtue of glazed doors, wrote down with a blunt pencil in a small book the word sibilance. "You will like the last pages," Basil Foyle whispered to Lady Leonora. "They are very good." "They would have been good," Lady Leonora answered, "if he had never read them." It was 11:30 by the ormolu clock when the house drew its breath in. The gallery lamps had been shaded. The last of the enthusiasts had gone down the steps to the street with their remarks, wrapped in their scarves. A footman removed the champagne tray with the practiced silence of one who understands conversation to be a fragile object. In the long room, the portraits in their enameled frames watched each other with an odd complicity, and the Venetian goblet, the slight and much discussed ornament of the evening, held the last glimmer of gold in its stem. Lady Octavia did not like to send her guests into the night without escort. She stood, gracious and tall, in the entrance hall, dispensing those small civilities that in her hands acquired the air of ceremonial. The painter had vanished earlier with a sulky brilliance that was either temperament or pose, and the general, with his neat grey head, had taken up a position by the mantelpiece and spoken in a low, confidential manner to a young woman in white glove. The director, lean and sleek, rehearsed his weariness. A niece, perhaps, had laughed politely at something and then stopped. Price, whose discretion had been tested by 3 generations of Lenthalls, drifted along the back passage that threaded the house like a theme. He had an errand in the little anteroom behind the gallery, where the practical clutter of an elegant evening collected itself. Spare glasses, a small dish of salted almonds forgotten by everyone with practiced self-restraint, a vase of white irises that smelt faintly of iron. He had in mind the Venetian goblet. It was valuable, and Lady Octavia liked objects in their places, as a conductor likes notes in their bars. He was 15 paces from the anteroom door when he heard it. It was not the sound one associates with distress. It was not a cry. It was the tone glass makes when it relinquishes its form and becomes a handful of light. A tinkle, then another, then silence, as if the silence had been there all along, and the sound merely disclosed it. He pushed the door, and the little room presented itself with a modesty that was suddenly indecent. On the carpet just within lay the painter, Mr. Vale, his long limbs arranged without symmetry, but without struggle. One hand rested on the rug, palm upwards, as if to display its clean, expressive fingers. The other lay near the plinth, and the plinth was spangled with a scatter of transparent shards. The Venetian goblet was no longer a goblet. The white irises, having no capacity for alarm, were as they had been, pale and exact. Price knelt and placed his 2 careful fingers on the sagging inner wrist. He felt skin, then nothing. He stood up, turned, and closed the door as one closes a conversation that has become improper. He walked the length of the passage and into the great hall. He did not hurry. He approached Lady Octavia when she was between guests and, with an inclination of the head that could have been a comment on the weather, said, "My lady." She looked at him. Her gaze was a blue one, steady and precise. "Yes, Price?" "There is a difficulty in the anteroom," he said, using his paternal plural. "Mr. Vale appears to be unwell." There was a fractional pause. Perhaps she heard what he had left unsaid. Perhaps she did not require it to be said. She turned to the general with a grace that transformed urgency into composure. "Peregrine," she said, "would you come with me for a moment? It seems Mr. Vale has overtaxed himself." It was admirable, that choice of a phrase. The young woman in the white gloves, left to contemplate her reflection in a glass panel, bit one glove with small white teeth and did not cry out. The director, registering the alteration, drifted after them with a curious stealth that was almost courtly. Others, seeing the movement, pretended not to see it and then, being English, encircled it with their gaze. In the anteroom, the general went down on one knee with military neatness and touched the painter's neck. He stood up at once and dusted his trousers with his hand, as if to remove the knowledge. "We shall need a doctor," he said, in a voice that implied he had commanded battlefield surgeons and expected to be obeyed now. "Price," Lady Octavia said. "Dr. Selwyn." "All ready, my lady," said Price, who had lifted the receiver and extracted the doctor's night number with the same quiet authority with which he would have taken a glass from an unsteady hand. The director had come in so lightly that even the irises had not noticed him. He looked down and then away, cupping his sharp chin as if measuring a line on a set. "Poor Julian," he murmured. "How inconvenient of him." "Mr. Greville," Lady Octavia said, not unkindly, "you will forgive me if I ask you to tell anyone who asks that Mr. Vale is indisposed and has taken himself home." "Of course," he said, and vanished, with an alacrity that suggested rehearsal. They all kept their voices low. Nobody named death. Dr. Selwyn arrived with a small bag and large spectacles, his hair disarranged to a precisely alarmed degree. He bent, touched, listened, and stood, and all the while, there was no sound in the house but the articulate silence of glass on the plinth where the goblet had become glitter. "He is dead," Dr. Selwyn said, making of it a diagnosis, not a proclamation. A curious look about the mouth, one would say. "Well," he broke off, put a stethoscope back into its place, and remembered he was in society. A seizure, perhaps. The heat and excitement. "Heat?" said the general dryly. "It has been a chilly evening." "There is a faint scent," the doctor said, half to himself. "Bitter. Perhaps almonds. But from where? The nuts, naturally." He glanced at the small dish with professional apology. Price, who had raised his hand to adjust the shade of the electric lamp, lowered it without having touched anything. He looked the merest fraction at the painter's right hand, the palm so clean, the fingertips faintly frosted, and then at the scattered points of the goblet in which the lamp made frugal stars. "Dr. Selwyn," Lady Octavia said, "I think we should send for the police." She spoke with a sort of judicial sadness, as if she were invoking a necessary ritual that belonged not to misfortune but to order. The general inclined his head. The young woman in white gloves, who had ventured a foot inside, retreated, and the director's laugh out in the corridor rose and fell like an actor's line in the wrong play. "Yes," said Dr. Selwyn. "Yes, Lady Octavia. I should recommend it." He opened his bag again with the air of one who would prefer to be useful, and found nothing in it that could be of use. Price went to the telephone and in his clear, untroubled voice, asked for the yard. He gave the address and a brief, careful account that neither startled the exchange nor compromised the household. When he had finished, the room had not altered. Death had entered as an uninvited guest who takes the most unobtrusive chair and waits to be noticed. In the gallery beyond, the portraits gazed upon their painted world. The Venetian goblet, which had been admired for its delicacy, lay repudiated in 100 delicate pieces. In the doorframe, a small point of glass caught on a hem and held it until the wearer, with no idea of the cause, lifted her skirt a fraction higher and passed on. The house returned to its breathless listening. And somewhere in that listening, the faintest draught moved the white irises so that they trembled and were still. Inspector Alleyn arrived without bustle, as if he had merely stepped from an adjacent room. The night porter, bewildered by the hush that had settled over the Deverell Gallery, held the front door as if it were a church and Alleyn a late communicant. Fox came respectfully at his shoulder, stouter, less elegant, and radiating his customary unobtrusive calm. The scent of lilies and champagne persisted beneath something sharper that Alleyn, whose senses were almost pedantic, filed away without comment. Mrs. Karslake, the gallery's proprietress, stood in the vestibule as if at the edge of a minor cataclysm. Her gown was an unassertive bronze that flattered a pale steadfastness. "Inspector," she said, keeping her voice in the register one adopts for hanging rooms and funerals, "I am sorry that—" "You mustn't be sorry for summoning us," Alleyn said gently. "You did precisely what you should. May I see?" He bowed as if to the house rather than the woman and moved into the principal salon. The broken case had given the room its new geometry. Where the central vitrine had been, glittering particles lay like frost in the carpet's nap, worn underfoot into a cold glitter here and there. The Venetian goblet, ethereal as dragonfly glass, sat intact upon its plinth, its pale stem fretted in blue and gold. It seemed doubly alive for having survived. Alleyn's gaze touched it without lingering and traveled instead to the slight figure on the settee. Mr. Miles Carroway had not, one felt, come to dramatic ends. His head rested a fraction forward on his breast. His left hand lay palm up, the fingers not fully relaxed, as if about to resume some argument he had paused only to listen to. A champagne flute, almost empty, stood on a low table at his elbow and had not even wept a circle into the wood. His scarf, grey and slender, was caught under him and creased as neatly as a bookmark. There was no outrage except the one that silenced him. "Fox," said Alleyn in the tone he might have used to suggest a second cup of tea, "would you kindly have Dr. Curtis shown in the instant he arrives? And perhaps, yes, make a note of the time." Fox, with his careful nod, peeled away. The guests had been contained along one wall like portraits waiting to be hung. Lady Oriel, long and silver as a blade, stood very straight with her gloves buttoned but not drawn on. Sir Julian Cray, whose own portrait of Lady Oriel had been the evening star until it was displaced by this unhappy matter, held himself as if recovering from a tempest of irritation. Daphne Mordaunt, the girl whose candid profile hung opposite, seemed composed from a distance, but her hands betrayed her with their small motions on the clasp of a beaded bag. Anthony Verrier, the theatre director, affected an interest in the ceiling mouldings. It was an interest that wandered at the slightest provocation. Captain Collinson gazed at the hearth-rug with the battle-worn patience of a man who has learned the dignity of standing still. Alleyn approached the settee and nearly knelt, but did not. The gesture would have been too intimate, too pastoral for the room and for the company. He bent, instead, as far as civility and observation could both be served. There was no mark. The complexion that in life had been sallow with wit was now simply drained. The faintest suggestion, no more than a rumor, of bitter almond hovered, then dissolved under lilies. He looked at the flute without touching it. A crescent of condensation had dried on the glass, rimmed at the lip with the palest lipstick trace. He glanced at Daphne's mouth and saw no paint at all, only the soft natural color of youth. At Lady Oriel's, enameled and severe. At Mrs. Karslake's, discreetly faded by the evening. He filed these nothings away as one files the dullest papers. They so often prove to contain the detail that matters. The vitrine's brass frame had slumped into itself like an exhausted spinster. Alleyn bent to the foot of the plinth where, among the starry debris, there was the smallest sweep of dust, as though a finger had drawn a crescent, and the thing that had once stood within it had been eased a fraction and put back. He did not point. He never pointed in public. He stood again and turned his head until he was looking for a moment into the very steady eyes of the gallery's butler, Mr. Pym, who had made himself invisible in a chair half behind a palm. Mr. Pym did not drop his gaze. He performed the faintest bow, no more than a thought, and looked away. He had seen something. Alleyn knew the look of a man with a well-ordered mind hovering at the edge of disclosure and prudence. Miss Larkin, the secretary, hovered at Mrs. Carslake's elbow with a shorthand notebook that had not been opened. She was a small, neat person with the powdered pallor of anxiety and a discipline that had become habit. At the faint crunch of Fox's shoe on the glass she started, and her eyes, in reflex, traveled not to the settee but to the narrow passage beyond the second salon, the passage, Alleyn supposed, that led to the cloakroom and the private office. "Mrs. Carslake," he said, gently drawing the necessary circle of authority about them, "for the present I must ask that no one leaves. We will make the green salon comfortable. Fox will take particulars. I will ask for your patience." There was the murmur of consent that attends the end of an aria. Sir Julian's mouth compressed with an artist's impatience thwarted, but he said nothing. Lady Oriel looked at the goblet and then at Alleyn with something like gratitude when she saw that he did not reach for it. Anthony Verrier produced a cigarette, then seemed to remember the place and put it away, which told Alleyn nothing, and a trifle more than nothing. He walked once more about the room, and this time noticed a program from the evening's private view, folded on the carpet beneath the settee. On its margin someone had drawn, in a soft pencil, the outline of the goblet's dragon stem. The pencil itself lay by the hearth, a 6B with a faint smear of ultramarine near the ferrule. Sir Julian's palette, earlier, had been heavy with that precise blue. "Fox," said Alleyn as the police surgeon came quietly through the doorway. "Let us keep our voices low. We will begin, I think, with a word or two. No inquisition. The green salon." He did not look again at the body. He had learned long ago that one saw the dead more clearly when one looked for a time at the living. Alleyn chose the smallest of Lady Honoria's reception rooms for the interviews, a little salon with pale walls and worn aubusson, made modest by a single jug of hellebores and the unobtrusive tick of a bracket clock. Outside, the rain had moderated to a steady whisper. A constable moved in the passage like a respectful moth. Lady Honoria came first. She sat upright, hands folded on a handkerchief so fine it was hardly there at all. Bereavement did not suit her, but she could wear it. "You must not trouble about the household, Inspector," she said, her eyes not leaving the fire. "We shall do whatever is right. Mr. Fenwick dined here frequently. I am most distressed." "It is good of you," Alleyn said. "Tell me of the evening as you remember it." She did, agreeably and without hesitation, furnishing the skeleton of times and rooms. The recording, begun at 8 in the garden room, the pause for refreshments, the second reel, the small wanderings customary with such a party. She had a knack for speaking of people as though they were well-trained hounds. "And after the second interval?" he asked. "I went upstairs for a shawl. A draught in the glass room isn't remarkable. One expects it with panes like sails. When I returned, Mr. Fenwick was alone by the palms. I thought he had fallen asleep. I was mistaken." She touched the handkerchief to the corner of one eye, as if reminding it of its function. "Inspector, you cannot think we are careless here." He said, "No." She gave him a small, grateful look and rose with quiet efficiency, leaving behind the softest suggestion of violet. Oliver Naismith took the same chair and sprawled in it, then remembered himself and sat straight. His long, delicate fingers worried at the seam of his cuff. "Fenwick could be an absolute brute," he said. "But murder, my dear man, this is not the theatre." "No," Alleyn said. "The theatre is louder." Naismith allowed himself a shaky laugh. "We were making an album of Lady Rosamond, you know. The voice is everything. Delia had been perfection, considering the draught and that infernal glare. We had to throw a shawl over the lamp." He stopped. "You threw the shawl?" Alleyn asked. "No, Lady Honoria's niece. What is her name? Miss Iris." "She did. I was busy watching levels with Harcourt." "Harcourt?" The sound man. Good fellow. Stolid. Fenwick had plagued him for an hour about hiss and rumble as if it were a newspaper paragraph. Did Mr. Fenwick drink much at the first interval? Nothing but that syrupy orange thing. He said whiskey would thicken his consonants. Was that his habit? No, Naismith said, and his eyes skittered away. He usually took a savage overproof and called it discipline. Tonight he was, oddly, temperate. Oddly, Alleyn repeated, and let the word fall. Miss Delia Burke arrived with a shawl about her throat, the famous profile guarded like a secret. She stood rather than sit, as if the act of sitting would be too intimate with grief. "I'd finished my speech," she said in a voice worn with restraint. "I went to the window. The glass gave a little crack, the sort one hears more than sees, and I asked for the shawl. I cannot abide drafts." Mr. Fenwick was with Dr. Peveril, looking at the program insert. She had discovered a misprint and was unusually animated. The faintest smile, quickly put away. He made a joke in poor taste. Then I went to the conservatory and drank a little water and prepared for the next scene. That is all. Did you speak with Mr. Fenwick again? I avoid quarrels before a take. He loved them. You drank water, Alleyn said. From the tray by the palms? The nearer one, she said after a moment. They had put 2 out. Mr. Pottle said it spared us crossing cables. Inspector, all of this is revolting. Must I? For the moment, no, he said. You have been very helpful. Miles Harcourt, the sound engineer, came in smelling faintly of fresh wiring and damp wool. His broad face wore the expression of a good dog sent into a room full of ottomans. I kept to my booth most of the time, sir, he said. Levels were sweet, odd as that room is. The glass throws one back like. I heard the tinkle, thought it was the tray. Then Miss Iris squeaked and Mr. Naismith shouted for the house phone. I stopped the machine. You noticed the smell? Alleyn asked. I noticed I didn't notice, if you take me. No cordite, nothing burnt. Only that orange cordial, too sweet by half. Whose arrangement was it to have 2 trays? Mr. Pottle's. He runs tight. Left hand for water, right hand for cordials, he said. We kept the cabling to the middle. Alleyn let him go and sent for Dr. Constance Peveril, who carried her intelligence like a birdcage, delicately, with the conviction it might escape. She presented her hands to him without meaning to, absurdly, as if he might ring for soap. I have never liked Mr. Fenwick, she said with shocking candor. He made himself odious. He called my notes scholarly embroidery and asked if we could not let the old girl speak for herself, by which he meant misquote at will. You understand I'm not sobbing. You were among the last to speak to him, Alleyn observed. I told him the genealogy was wrong in the 3rd stanza. He said truths were improved by shapely lies. I told him the dead could not answer. He bowed. I left. She looked at her shoes. My quarrel was not to the death, Inspector. You may write that down. I shan't write anything down, Alleyn said, and watched the relief move over her face like a small breeze. When at last Mr. Pottle, the butler, appeared, his neatness preceded him. He closed the door as if engaging a gentleman's attention. I beg to state, sir, he said, that the room was laid as always for recording nights. 2 trays, water with lemon on the left, cordial, orange and barley on the right. Fresh glasses each interval. No one is suffered to meddle with the disposals. No one, Alleyn said mildly. Meaning, sir, Mr. Pottle amended. No one is expected. And yet tonight the water stood to the right when I came in, Mr. Pottle. A pause, not even as long as the tick of the bracket clock. Then I was at fault, sir, the butler said. He met Alleyn's eye for one impeccable second. It will not occur again. No, said Alleyn. I suppose it won't. He let him go and listened to the clock. It was not evidence that troubled him, but the way it had been kept from troubling anyone else. Outside, the rain pressed the city into quietness, and in the great glass room the hellebores bent their heads as if listening. He thought of a man who had altered his habit for an evening, and of hands practiced in ritual that had done something unpracticed and called it a mistake. He rang the bell and asked for the maid. Alleyn found his way below stairs with the unobtrusiveness of a gentleman who has asked for nothing more alarming than a glass of water. Lady Eversley's household, so composed above, settled here into its hum of copper, soap, and polished silence. The servants' hall, with its long deal table and an assortment of upright chairs that would never presume to comfort, received him with a kind of respectful vacancy. Mr. Blore, the butler, materialized as if conjured by the soft click of the baize door. He had that particular butler's gravity which seems to have been laid down in quiet strata over many decades. One would not have expected him to smile or to frown. He did neither. "If you could spare me a moment, Mr. Blore?" "Certainly, sir." The correct small inclination of the head. "We are extremely distressed for what has occurred." "As are we all." Alleyn's eyes took in the neat array of keys hung on a board by the dresser, brass tags engraved with the names of rooms and cabinets. One, on a black ribbon beginning to fray, hung slightly awry. "And you, I fancy, have seen much and intend to say little." "Sir," Mr. Blore's look was perfectly blank, but the minute pause belonged to a man who has moved his king to a safe square. "You'll know the sequence of last evening," Alleyn went on mildly. "The wine and liqueurs, the fragile Venetian goblets, the unfortunate breakage, and later, Mr. Dane in the morning room." "It is as you say, sir. The goblets are her ladyship's. They are not commonly used." "So I understand." Alleyn let his gaze return to the rack of keys. "You keep the key to the glass cabinet?" "I do, sir. When her ladyship requires it, I unlock and remain." The glance, quick and unwilling, flickered to the key and away. "I did so last evening. Afterwards, all fragments were cleared, sir." "By whom?" "Tyler and Elsie, sir." Mr. Blore's eye travelled past Alleyn's shoulder. "If you please." Tyler materialized with a linen glass cloth over one arm, a young man of anxious rectitude. Elsie, the parlour maid, came behind him, her hands worrying at their own fingers. She was very young and made a business of keeping her eyes down, which is a way of looking. "You swept the fragments?" Alleyn asked. "Yes, sir," said Tyler. "At once, sir." "In a dustpan, sir," Elsie added. "Like little bits of rain, sir." "Rain," Alleyn repeated. "And what happened to this shower?" "Scullery bin, sir," Tyler supplied, "as is proper." "And stayed there?" A pause. It was so small a pause that one would have missed it in a noisier room. In the servants' hall, it had the consequence of a confession. "I couldn't rightly say, sir," said Elsie in a softer voice. "Only, when I come to empty after the coffee, it seemed as if, well, it wasn't just as I left it." "Disturbed," Alleyn suggested. Her hands twisted themselves for an instant. "Yes, sir." "By whom?" "I couldn't say, sir." There was the small, loyal panic in the glance she stole at Mr. Blore. "Very good," Alleyn said easily, as if he had asked weather and been told it might rain. "You took coffee to the morning room?" "Yes, sir," from Tyler. "At 11, sir. Mr. Dane was then with his glass. And afterwards?" "Mrs. Sully found him, sir, with permission." Mrs. Sully, the housekeeper, came in on her own authority. She smelled of beeswax and starch, and had, Alleyn thought, the practical heart of a ship's boatswain. She approved of order and respected hierarchy, which is to say, she disapproved of murder without theatricals. "I won't have Elsie upset herself," Mrs. Sully announced without heat. "It isn't our place." "Of course," said Alleyn. "It is nevertheless my business to say that I shall need your places, all of them. May I ask, who uses the back telephone?" Her look then was ancient and level. "It is not for the family, sir." "So I imagined." He waited. "Silence is a kind of instrument," Mrs. Sully, who had wielded hers for years, played a note almost too discreet to hear. Sometimes a lady, if there is a difficulty with the upstairs line. Her eyes, unyieldingly impersonal, looked past him. I couldn't say who, sir. Of course. Alleyn turned to the butler. You will have sent Sir Lionel's car by the Mews. Pritchard took it, sir, after 11. Sir Lionel wished to avoid troubling the front. It is not unusual, sir. No. Pritchard would be dealt with in due course. And Mr. Blore, when you say afterwards all fragments were cleared, you mean to say they were not all? The butler had the grace not to pretend. Sir, he said, and tidied the corner of a tray needlessly. There was a faint stain of iodine on his thumb. One may be a very small thing. Indeed, Alleyn murmured. Sometimes the smallest are the sharpest. He moved mildly towards the keys. Only you and Lady Eversley keep keys. That is so, sir. And the cabinet was locked? It was, sir. Thank you. He did not look as Mr. Blore's eyes, again against their will, touched the black ribbon with its frayed edge. In the pantry, beyond, Tyler set down a glass that chimed almost inaudibly against its neighbor, the briefest tremor of clear sound. Alleyn walked to the pantry door and stood in it. Tyler polished with care. He held up one of the delicate bowls to the light, and, as the linen passed its lip, a pale line leapt and vanished, a tiny, treacherous smile. Careful, Alleyn said, and Tyler, flustered, nodded. Glass breathed and bit if mishandled. So did houses. The household's day was constructed of rituals as regular as tides, trays at precise intervals, blinds drawn and lifted, keys replaced with their bows turned this way and not that. Somewhere, in those quiet observances, something had gone against the grain. Alleyn, very gently, found he was listening for it as one listens for a clock that has missed a beat. The house had begun its nocturne. Doors that had sung earlier with laughter now closed themselves with mindful tact, and the uncarpeted stretches of passage seemed to hold their breath. In the gallery, the flowers drooped a little, their evening bravery spent. Their perfume, freed of competing scents, was faintly medicinal. Alleyn, who disliked intruding upon servants at their work, but liked even less to let a rhythm conceal its own betrayal, went quietly towards the butler's pantry. A narrow lamp burned there. The butler, who had earlier maintained a careful neutrality of demeanor that was as much a uniform as his coat, was folding linen. His hands were competent, the nails half-mooned and colorless. On the dresser lay a silver salver and the telltale cloth with its paradisiacal field of rings and pale watermarks, a pattern of the evening's ministrations. If you're quite certain I'm not in your way, Alleyn said, I'd be grateful to see how you carry champagne in this house. The butler glanced, not so much at Alleyn as at that absence of offense in his voice. He turned to the salver. Her ladyship prefers it from the East Butler's pantry, sir. Shorter to the gallery. We use the thin stem, sir, with the plain bowls for guests. Her ladyship has the Zeringer. Ah, said Alleyn mildly, and waited. The Venetian, sir, the butler added. Gold thread in the lip, 2 only, her ladyship's and, if there is a guest of honor, if she so orders. He touched the folded cloth with an unconscious delicacy. She had it tonight. Alleyn looked at the tray. He touched, with a long forefinger, the faint circles in the linen. There was a rank of delicate ovals where stems had rested, and one more emphatic ring at the head, slightly larger, slightly brighter where the cloth had been pressed by a heavier foot. Would you indulge me, he said, by laying them out as they were? As your habit dictates. Not as convenience would prompt, but as the house commands. The butler hesitated, then complied. He took from a shelf 6 flutes of the ordinary kind and, after a brief rummage, the last remaining Venetian, wrapped in tissue. He placed them with the thoughtless automatic exactness of practice, 3 along one side, 3 along the other, the Venetian at the head nearest the carrier. The salver became a diagram of order. Alleyn stepped back. In his mind's eye, the room upstairs drew itself upon the arrangement, people grouped by rank and ease, the subtle choreography of service, the invisible path the butler's arm would make among them. "The guest of honor?" Alleyn asked. The butler's eyes did not lift. "Mr. The deceased was named so by her ladyship when she raised the toast, sir. The painter's patronage, I believe." "Indeed." Alleyn's gaze dropped to the cloth again. Besides the rings, there was a small crescent of damp with an odd glitter to it, as if ground mica had been pressed into the fiber. He put his finger on it lightly and then brought his hand to his nose. There was a whisper of vinegar, no more than a memory of it, clean and faintly fierce. "Do you habitually polish the Zeringers differently?" he asked. The butler looked surprised into respect. "Her ladyship's Venetian take a dash of vinegar, sir. Soap clouds the gold. The plain glasses we do in hot water and spirit. Then if I were, let us say, to smell the cloth where your hand steadied the tray, here," he touched the head of the salver, "I should expect vinegar, not here." He indicated one of the flanking rings. "And yet, it will have been dripped, sir, perhaps?" "Perhaps." Alleyn's tone had the softness of a hand smoothing paper. He stood a moment, concealing with courtesy the small stir of conclusion in himself. The ritual had been clear. The house honored the hostess with her demarcated luxury. The guest of honor, if so designated, might share it. But before the toast there had been a movement, barely seen, an exchange politely masked by the exigencies of service. He remembered the smallest of gestures by the dead man, an apologetic inclination of his head toward the hostess, which had seemed no more than a social grace. It might, in a different light, be a request. He turned to Fox, who had appeared with his large hands discreetly empty. "Brr," Alleyn said, as if the word had idly occurred to him, "would you ask Miss, our young lady of the stage, to be kind enough to recall where she stood for the toast, and whether her glass was touched afterwards? And you might have a word with the maid who swept in the gallery. Not to badger, to ask what she found by the dais and whether she put anything aside that was not quite like the rest." Fox nodded and withdrew with the padded tread of a benevolent bear. Alleyn, left with the butler and the lingering thin smell of vinegar, examined again the tray. The ritual of the house was a visible thing, like lines in a lawn after mowing. One could see where it had been respected and where, minutely, someone had trodden contrary. There was, too, the question of lipstick. The hostess's self-discipline extended to her toilette. Alleyn would have laid a small wager that she did not stain a glass at her own party. Yet one of the shards he had seen upstairs had offered a ghost of color. That color had been a little vulgar for the room. He thanked the butler, took the wrapped Venetian in his hand, very lightly, as if it might bruise, and then, with care that acknowledged both the object's value and the man's pride, put it back. "Your order," he said, "is admirable." "It's the way we do, sir," said the butler. And if there was anything in it, it was neither vanity nor apology, but the quiet assertion of a habit not lightly altered. When Alleyn climbed back towards the gallery, the housekeeper was winding the tall clock on the landing. The note it gave was small and calm. He stood to let it sound. The large hand moved to the hour. In the panel of glass before its face, he saw his own reflection, elongated, and beyond it, the faint glitter of a single shard left upon the balustrade, overlooked or set by a conscientious maid as a reminder. It trapped, for an instant, the light of the stair lamp and gave it back to him with ironic neatness. He did not touch it. He went on up. The house had drifted into that hush peculiar to great London properties in the late small hours, a large silence composed of minor ones, respectful of carpet, hinge, and long habit. Inspector Rowan Aubrey, who had learned to think in such hushes, sat with his notebook at Lady Honoria's escritoire and listened. Beyond the door, the tall clock counted itself out with an attenuated patter, as if it too went shod in felt. Mr. Fisk, the butler, came in without announcing himself. He did not conceivably creak, yet something in him suggested suppressed sound. He had the look of a man at last deciding to place a card face up. "If you please, sir," he said, and presented a square of paper, folded and refolded along the same meditative creases. Aubrey did not touch it at once. "You have been considering whether you ought?" "Yes, sir." "You have decided that you ought?" Mr. Fisk's jaw acknowledged this. "I received it an hour before the guests arrived, sir, on a salver with the post. I took it to be from her ladyship." He paused. "It is not." Aubrey opened the paper on the blotter. It was a half-sheet from the Davenant Gallery's stationery drawer, typed in a tidy but ungenerous hand. "Mr. Fisk, for this evening's preview we must indulge Sir Gideon. Set a flute rather than his usual tumbler. He will not drink, but appearances matter. Pour a mere show. H.D. The signature is—" "A rubber stamp kept in the office safe," said Mr. Fisk implacably. "Miss Pierce has the key. I have a duplicate for emergencies. The stamp was used recently. I had occasion to witness a receipt." "And you obeyed the instruction?" "Yes, sir." Aubrey's eyes travelled to the last line, where the rubber letters had left the faintest shadow outside their own authority, a blur on the ascender of the D. "You did not think it odd that her ladyship should concern herself with that level of detail?" "I thought it odd," Mr. Fisk said, "and I've thought it odder ever since." There was a tap, polite, rather like a seat being reserved in a crowded theatre. Miss Eleanor Pierce, the gallery manager, looked in and made an apology of her neatness. She had strained herself into a composure tight as the ribbon at her throat. "I beg pardon, Mr. Fisk. Inspector, I am only— Has Mr. Cartwright been seen?" "Mr. Cartwright?" Aubrey asked. "Her ladyship's secretary, Noel Cartwright. He went out after 11, Miss Pierce said, with a letter for the night post. He has not returned. His coat is still in the cloakroom." "Whose letter?" Aubrey asked. Miss Pierce hesitated by a fraction, as if something bruised at the question. "Mine," she said at last. "A note to the printers regarding tomorrow's catalogue errata." Mr. Fisk did not move. He looked at the middle distance, and the middle distance declined to look back. Aubrey folded the typed instruction and put it in his pocket. "Perhaps he has merely mislaid himself in the fog." "There is no fog," Miss Pierce said, with an air of accusing the weather of failing impropriety. "There is a damp, and the Muse is ill-lit, but no fog." "Then," Aubrey said, "we will send Barrett round the block and see. In the meantime, you will do nothing without telling me." She inclined her head and withdrew, light, precise, and a little too erasing in her exit. When the door shut, there came, from somewhere to the right of the morning room, a minute sound more suggestion than event. A sigh of crystal. Mr. Fisk turned his head. "That will be the North case, sir. It has not been itself since the move." They went together along the corridor to the private gallery. Lamps had been left on low, and the canvases kept their counsel as if a room full of people had decided at once to withhold an opinion. The long glass case that housed Julian Vale's preparatory studies for the glass hours had developed, across its foremost pane, a hairline, a pale vein like a winter-numb finger. "Not fallen," Aubrey said, "only thinking of it." "Yes, sir." He bent, and the crack offered him nothing but its own slightness. In the dim reflection he saw Mr. Fisk, silvered, diminished, and, behind them both, the chair where Sir Gideon had sat earlier, too still, too composed. "Tell me about the stamp," Aubrey said, still looking at the floor. "The rubber stamp is kept in a velvet bag in Miss Pierce's drawer," Fisk replied. "It has occasionally been used to sign florists' receipts or acknowledgements. Her ladyship dislikes repetition of her handwriting. The drawer is locked." "Always." "And yet a letter exists that is not hers." Aubrey's voice did not accuse. It adjudged the air. "Do you suppose, Miss Pierce—" "I suppose, sir, that keys are like habits," Mr. Fisk said carefully. "They are shared without being shared." Aubrey let that sit. He had the sense of things arranging themselves in the next room, beyond a wall or two. Not moving, perhaps, but orienting. The injured glass made a second, almost erotic murmur, as if remembering some previous pressure. "There is another matter," Mr. Fisk said in a lower tone. "The decanter used for her ladyship's water at table. It is always placed by me at the right-hand side. This evening it was found at the left, already poured." "By whom?" "By me," he said, and stood, not quite squarely in his own statement. "Very well," Aubrey said. "We will receive the morning as if it were an ordinary morning. You will tell your staff nothing more than you must, and if Mr. Cartwright comes in, he is to remain within reach." Mr. Fisk inclined. "Sir." The crack held the lamplight, a slender invitation to fracture. In the interval before it accepted or refused, Aubrey returned to the morning room and sent Barrett into the mews. He sat down, folded his hands, and allowed the hush to share its information. The false letter's modest ambition, the vanished secretary's unpersuasive errand, the glass case's foreknowledge. When Barrett came back, empty-handed, he was not surprised. He merely looked at the empty hook where Mr. Cartwright's coat should not have been and waited for a silence to produce, as it often did, the next quiet piece. By late afternoon, the house had fallen into the sort of hush that follows decisive bad news. The clocks, having earlier seemed to hurry the day forward, now ticked with decorous stolidity. In the morning room, the last of the pale sun rested upon the bowl of chrysanthemums, and as Alleyn stood very still, one could almost see the minute motes in that beam adjust themselves and drift anew. So did his thoughts. He had learned, over years of this particular trade, to let the drama run out of a room and leave behind its pattern. He did not press, not yet. Instead, he allowed the recollections of the previous evening to reassemble themselves with the indifference of dust resettling on a mantelpiece. There was the glass, Venetian, delicate, with its spiral of trapped air, and the crisp, fugitive sound when it went. No scream, no spectacular outcry, an apology, a flutter of sympathy, Davy's tactful whisking away of fragments in a napkin and the faint, innocent interest of the others. A small accident subsumed by conversation. The more obvious that it had been permitted to be nothing, the more it waited now, like a neglected chord. There was Lord Ashworth's last hour in this room. The brandy was half taken. It had not been his habit, Mrs. Higgins suggested, to leave the decanter so. The pill-box had been emptied, though Dr. Gresham, when one mentioned sleeping draughts, had performed a professional shrug and said something about hot tonics and personal management. The little shepherdess on the mantel, she faced now towards the hearth, not towards the door. A small shift, not made by Davy's careful hand. It had been touched and not reset. Someone had been at ease here, careless for a moment in the midst of tremendous care. Finally, this morning's additions. Miss Marchmont's sudden illness, the solicitor's call about a trust that required Lord Ashworth's signature. The dates pressed upon one another with the sort of insistence people of this world found easiest to disown. To insist in such circles was to be in poor taste. One therefore arranged, one diverted, one delayed, one mislaid a paper. Alleyn thought of Lady Selina. Her grief was authentic and curated. She gave one what one could decently accept. She spoke of her brother's gifts, his reformed habits, his wish to put things straight. Of Miss Marchmont, she spoke with a solicitousness that was almost proprietorial. Sir Julian, urbane, undeniably helpful, had been full of those little phrases that make no claim to content and yet take up a deal of space. Loose ends, sensible arrangements, the family view. He had not, Alleyn remembered, said Miss Marchmont's view. Davies, forever measured, had made one misstep. He had called from the telephone door with more anxiety than was proper to his office, and had looked towards Lady Selina before he remembered to look toward the inspector. Mrs. Higgins, hands folded, had been dutiful and incomplete. People who run large houses acquire a habit of holding the line between the visible and the true. One does not lie. One edits. He moved at last, and his movement was not to a person but to the window. The lawns were clipped, the cedar absurdly permanent, the gravel disturbed where the doctor's motor car had stood. He could hear, just conceivably, the small metallic rattle in the scullery where teacups are stacked. Rituals continued. That was their solace and their trap. If Lord Ashworth had genuinely meant, to sign away his last instrument of control over Miss Marchmont's future that morning, his death before noon was tidy for someone. It would keep a promise in abeyance. It would permit another to continue arranging. But there was more than money in the temper of this house. Alleyn felt, with the curious certainty that comes when a picture begins, almost despite the painter, to present itself, that the motive here was as much about agency as about advantage. Lady Selina would suffer any indignity rather than vulgarity. She would not, he thought, countenance scandal. Sir Julian would not soil his cuffs. He would prefer to remain adjacent to power rather than within it. Miss Marchmont's illness, if natural, was convenient. If induced, it was either a bungled warning or a miscalculation. He reminded himself, with a small inward grimace at his own vanity, that it is possible to make a large theory from small dust. Yet the pattern would not quite be dissuaded. He had seen again, while Mrs. Higgins spoke of trays and Dr. Gresham of sedatives, an image of the decanter, the water jug, the glass, and the small white circle on the tray where something else had recently stood. He had seen, in Davies's minute, flinch, not guilt, but loyalty, outrun by its object. He had heard, in Sir Julian's pleasantries, a note of that very old English conceit, that women are safer when guided. He rang for Davies then, not to confront, but to arrange. He asked that the family, such as was in residence, be in the small drawing-room after dinner. He begged, in those tones of courteous imposition he used when he intended to have his way, a quiet word with Dr. Gresham before the evening began. And he sent off, by Davies' hand, a short note to the London solicitor, a request that any decision regarding the Marchmont Trust be delayed until the coroner had pronounced, and that any papers be held at the firm's office and not forwarded to the house. When Davies had gone, Alleyn stood once more in the near-silent room with its unruffled flowers, and observed, in the faint, dusty light, how little air is disturbed by a decision. He felt the pieces subside, as dust does, into a provisional order. It would serve for the moment. Later, in a private room and with as few as possible to witness, he thought he might gently lift one corner of the pattern and see who moved. By common assent, and with no greater ceremony than a suggestion from the butler, the family gathered after dinner in the small drawing-room, where the lamps threw a gentle radiance upon Chippendale chairs and prim little tables arranged as if for a still life. The evening, having reminded itself of politeness, now made a quiet bow to necessity. Lady Selina sat slightly apart, the measured composure of her profile like a classical coin. Sir Julian stood by the mantel, hands loosely clasped behind his back, the casual stance of a practiced witness. Miss Daphne, pale and muffled in a shawl, had insisted upon coming down and did so with the air of one obeying a propriety that cost her effort. Dr. Gresham hovered, prepared to withdraw if the talk proved unsuitable. Davies, in a discreet penumbra by the door, waited upon coffee. Alleyn had chosen the smaller room for its very intimacy. The large drawing-room would have lent itself to oratory. This one conspired toward conversation. He remained standing for a moment, very courteous in his preface, his voice as well-ordered as the room. "If you will indulge me," he said, "I hope to ask a few questions that touch upon your usual habits here. Those little domestic rituals which, so far as I've observed, are the very architecture of your comfort. It is frequently in the deviation from such habits that one finds meaning. Nobody objected. The word meaning floated so gently, seemed almost to reassure. Davies passed among them with the tray. The coffee cups made their soft ticks upon saucers. At Alleyn's request, the brandy appeared, amber in its squat decanter. He glanced, almost as if to himself, at the companion bottles upon the sideboard. "I'm told his lordship preferred the green Venetian glass after dinner," he remarked, as if invoking a harmless ghost. A finger only, and the decanter returned to the second position. "To the left," Sir Julian said, too readily. He had a quirk for symmetry. Did he indeed? Alleyn's tone accepted, shelved, remembered. And the green glass? "It was broken," Lady Selina said, with that grave candor great ladies bring to small mortifications. "Last night, an unfortunate little accident." "Ah, yes." Alleyn crossed to the mantel and, with the most idle of gestures, touched the porcelain shepherdess that stood demurely at its edge. The figure described the smallest of arcs and settled into a circle of paler dust. "Another accident," he said to no one in particular. "I noticed she had migrated." Miss Daphne's eyes followed the shepherdess's journey with an attention that looked, in that instant, as involuntary as a flinch. Sir Julian glanced away. The movement was as slight as the shepherdess's, and no more lost upon Alleyn. "If we may have clarity upon a small calendar point," Alleyn went on, turning with courteous persistence, "his lordship had an entry in his appointment book, SM, final arrangements for this morning." He allowed the name to float between them like a fragrance. "Mr. Davies tells me there was a telephone call to the Manor from Mr. Swithin Miles's office in London." "Exactly so," Sir Julian said, relieved by a recognizable fact. "Swithin Miles, our man of business, a fussing creature. He will have wanted a signature. These people live by signatures." "Ah," said Alleyn, as if the matter were now so tidy it could be put away. "And the final arrangements?" "The trust," Lady Selina said. Her hand came to rest upon Miss Daphne's. Her tone gave nothing away but assumption. "My niece's affairs were to be settled." "At last," Miss Daphne murmured, a remark so subdued that it might have been borne entirely on the bow of breath. There was no triumph in it, only a species of astonishment, as if some long-delayed train had been heard at last in the distance. Alleyn inclined his head. "It is a queer fate, is it not, that our important mornings are so often stolen by indifferent nights? May I trespass upon your patience for 2 further points of routine? Who was responsible for his lordship's pills? I understand he took, by his doctor's advice, a sedative." Dr. Gresham, who had been a shadow of professional discretion, spoke up. "A mild restorative. The dose is printed upon the label. I left it in Mrs. Higgins's charge. She has managed such things for years." "Very good," Alleyn said. "And it was filled most recently?" "I replenished the box yesterday afternoon," came Mrs. Higgins's voice from the doorway where she had paused, having, like all good housekeepers, a gift for appearing at the precise instant her name required it. She stood very straight, hands folded, eyes upon the horizon of Allen's collar. "As usual, sir. 2 tablets in the bedside dish, the bottle in the cupboard." "You are kind," Alleyn said with a smile that excused her correctness. "Then one last trifle. After the household retired, did anyone ring for the butler? Any night bell?" "No, sir," Davies answered. "All was quiet. Thank you." He let the quiet return, as if to prove the truth of it. The room, so politely arranged, had acquired another dimension, filled now with things unsaid. He set down his cup and, with a movement as unobtrusive as a page being turned, addressed Miss Daphne. "If Dr. Gresham allows, I should be grateful for a word with you presently." "Alone," he added, the last word so gentle that it did not bruise the air. Lady Selina's hand tightened infinitesimally. "Surely," she said, "anything that concerns my niece concerns us all." Alleyn finished for her, bowing slightly. "Yes, and so it shall. But first a word with Miss Marchmont, then with you, Lady Selina, and then, if you please, we will speak together again. I have asked Mr. Swithin Miles to send a clerk down tonight with a copy of the draft deed. I'm much afraid he is a fussing creature." The small pleasantry did its work. The tension yielded a fraction. But when Alleyn moved to open the door for Miss Daphne, her glance crossed Sir Julian's with the briefest enquiry and received the briefest denial. The exchange, polished by years of family discipline, was so smooth that it would have slipped between heartbeats. It did not slip past Alleyn. He stood aside. The corridor was quiet, the lamps along it dim to civility. The door closed with the softest click, and, in the hush that followed, Blackwood Manor seemed to lean a little towards the future, listening. The lamplight seemed to lose a shade of its warmth, as if the room itself had drawn back a fraction from what was about to be said. Alleyn, who disliked the abrupt gesture, allowed his words to arrive as one might set fine china upon a frail table, without jar, yet with purpose. "We must return for a moment to last night," he said, "to the matter of the Venetian goblet, to a small porcelain shepherdess, and to Lord Ashworth's very steady habits." Sir Julian moved slightly, a careful redistribution of weight that did nothing so obvious as betray discomfort, yet made visible the presence of a thought not entirely at ease. Lady Selina was very still. Miss Marchmont, pale and upright, had folded her handkerchief into a small trembling square. Lord Ashworth, Alleyn continued, possessed that precise sort of regularity which renders departures conspicuous. His brandy at 10, his desk ordered to an almost military degree, his pen placed to the left, the appointment book open to the morrow. Even his mantle ornaments had their old established stations. One in particular, the shepherdess, has left on the marble a faint ring of clean. It is an old-fashioned signal, I suppose, by which a housekeeper may test the maid's feather duster. But this morning the ring showed itself on the wrong side of the figure. "Good heavens," said Lady Selina very gently, "must dust betray us all?" "It betrays only those who think it will not," Alleyn replied, with a courteous inclination of his head. The little figure conceals a key, snugly fitted into the hollow of its base. A convenient habit, and, I dare say, known within the family. Someone took the key last night, and later replaced it not quite as it had been. Someone then used the key to open Lord Ashworth's inner drawer, which has been searched since his death. The attempt at tidiness, the realigned pen, the adjusted blotter, was intelligent but not perfect. Sir Julian made a small, almost affable sound. "Conveniently ambiguous, Inspector. You might tie such minutiae to anyone in the house who knows where that old key lies." "I agree," said Alleyn mildly. "Minutiae become less ambiguous when they conspire. Lord Ashworth intended to sign this morning the transfer of Miss Marchmont's trust. The solicitor's insistence confirms as much. Before that could be done, he died in his chair, with a glass of brandy left uncharacteristically half-finished. His pill-box, usually nursed along for weeks, was empty overnight. A very quiet death in the very seat where he habitually wrote his letters, and with the document he was to sign no longer discoverable in his desk." Miss Marchmont let out a small breath. "The paper, was it destroyed?" "In part," said Alleyn. "Your library fire, sir," he addressed Sir Julian without raising his tone, "was laid and lit early, though not by the staff and not at Lady Selina's request. In the grate, beneath a crust of ash, there remained a thread of red tape and the corner of a blue paper. A ridiculous survival, you might say, but that is what fires leave for those who take the trouble to look." There was a little stir from the chair by the hearth. Mr. Davies, summoned on Alleyn's earlier bell and quiet as a shadow in the corner, looked at the fire as if it had personal obligations it had failed to meet. Lady Selina's fingers found the edge of the sofa cushion and perfected it. "I lighted no fire," she said, with a composure that had begun to sound like an exertion. I dislike the smell in mild weather. Sir Julian's hand, still on the mantel, released it and fell to his side with deliberate ease. Am I to understand, he asked with the courtesy of an old club room, that you are advancing the theory that I murdered my cousin to prevent a signature? Alleyn's gaze met his without either challenge or retreat. I am proposing that you alone combined intimate access with a certain useful ignorance. It was you who was closest to the goblet when it broke, a moment of bustle that allowed you to reach the mantel quite unremarked. You spoke, last night, of tidying loose ends and of a family view which did not include Miss Marchmont's own. This morning, when offered any number of places from which to take your coffee, you chose the library, where the great would hide a multitude of ordinaries. Mr. Davies, very loyal and very careful, did not say you asked for a light at once. He said only that a fire seemed to have been attended to. Servants speak a dialect of truth, Sir Julian. It can be read. Silence accomplished more than any raised voice. It carried across the small room and settled upon them all like a shawl. Miss Marchmont, with that curious courage of the unworldly, said simply, "Julian?" Sir Julian looked at her very kindly. The look did him credit and, for a moment, made Alleyn almost regret the function that had brought him to this room. "My dear child," Sir Julian said, "I have always liked you vastly, you know. It would have been dreadful to see you blown about like a feather by the first stiff wind of independence. This house, your aunt, the name. Such things require ballast." Lady Selina's breath caught and was suppressed as soundlessly as a sob permitted itself to exist. Alleyn's voice, when it came, was no more than a gentleman's assent at the close of a string quartet. You crushed the remaining tablets into Lord Ashworth's brandy, trusting to what the coroner will, with good reason, call misadventure. You emptied the box to complete the appearance. Later, you removed the draught from the drawer and consigned it to the fire. Miss Marchmont's indisposition this afternoon, was that intended as kindness too? Sir Julian's mouth curved in a dry approximation of a smile. Salts and water, Inspector. If she stayed in bed, the London men would have found no one to hustle. One does what one can. Quite, said Alleyn, with that gentleness he reserved for gravely mistaken men. He turned to Lady Selina. Ma'am, I regret that this discussion has taken place under your roof. There will be formalities, but not tonight. Sir Julian inclined his head as if accepting a well-played stroke. No melodrama, then? No, Alleyn said. There has been quite enough breaking of glass. The fire made a small, decorous sound, as if acquiescing. Outside, the wind moved across the lawns and was heard only by those who had learned to listen. The confession did not shatter the evening so much as recompose it. Out of the broken pattern, a new arrangement formed, quieter, diminished, like a quartet continuing after the first violin has laid down her bow. Alleyn allowed the silence its right, then spoke in that courteous voice which set duty within the frame of good manners. Lady Selina, I must ask you to come with me. Arrangements have been made for a discreet conveyance to the local station. There will be no unnecessary display. She inclined her head with the same economical grace with which she might have acknowledged a guest's departure at the end of a successful dinner. I should like 10 minutes, she said. Mrs. Higgins will bring my coat. I will write 2 letters. You shall have them, Alleyn replied. I must ask that the door remain open. Miss Marchmont had not moved. Her hands, those careful hands once trained into acceptable accomplishments, needlework, scales, a flawless curtsy, lay untidy in her lap. When Lady Selina rose, she paused beside her, the ghost of an old habit prompting her to smooth the girl's hair with the barest touch. Daphne, she said, and in the single utterance there was such rehearsed tenderness that one understood it had been practiced for years until it resembled love so closely that only catastrophe could tell them apart. You must write to Mr. Selwyn tomorrow. Ask him to see to the servants' wages without delay. Tell him the conservatory needs attention. Matthews has been overwatering the maidenhair fern. And Do not be generous with Sir Julian. He has good manners and no ballast." Sir Julian made a sound of protest that was almost comic in its timing and its immediate restraint. He moved to the window and studied his reflection in the black glass, as if it could provide him with a more satisfactory response than any he possessed. Mrs. Higgins appeared, silent and competent, with a dark coat and a small traveling case that, by some domestic sorcery, already contained the necessary trifles. She did not look directly at her mistress, but attended to the buttons with careful fingers, gathering invisible threads from the silk as if tidying the last of a life's loose ends. Davies, hovering at the threshold, held out a muff and, catching Alleyn's eye, inclined his head almost imperceptibly, the bow of a man who had guessed more than he would ever say. "There will be a car at the west door," Alleyn said. "We shall avoid the front drive." "Thank you," Lady Selina answered. "One does what one can for the house." In the library, she wrote quickly, the scratch of the pen companionable in the old room. Alleyn remained by the open door, and, beyond his shoulder, Daphne stood as if called up at a prize-giving, neither advancing nor retreating. When Lady Selina had finished, she sealed one envelope with a ring that had belonged to her mother. The other she left unsealed upon the blotter. "For Mr. Selwyn," she said, indicating the sealed note. "This for Daphne, when you consider she has had her tea. Not before." Alleyn took them without comment. He had learned that to protect dignity at the Close was to secure more truth than any amount of insistence earlier. Outside, the gravel stirred under the tires of a dark car that had appeared without fuss. A single constable waited by the west steps with that studied indifference the police keep for the griefs of their betters. Lady Selina paused on the threshold as if measuring something invisible. In the corridor, a glass-fronted cabinet stood with its door a fraction open, a twin to the Venetian goblet glimmering within. Davies, who must have noticed it many times, stepped forward and closed it gently. The tiny click was neat as punctuation. "Inspector," Sir Julian said, attempting a manner he had mislaid. "These matters, the press, there need be no announcement tonight," Alleyn answered. "You will permit me to suggest that your duty lies with Miss Marchmont." He did not add that Sir Julian's useful instincts, those elegant half-measures favoured by his type, had no application here. At the car, Lady Selina turned only once. "Daphne," she said again, and there was neither admission nor appeal in it. It was simply the last word of a long conversation. Daphne made a small motion, the sort of gesture one makes on the brink of embrace, and then dropped her hands. "Goodbye, Aunt," she said, and the unadorned formality was cruel because it was kind. The door closed. The car moved off down the side drive, its lamps making a moving geometry among the rhododendrons. The house breathed out. Somewhere, discreetly, a clock chimed the quarter, and the sound, absorbed by carpets and curtains and the very nap of inheritance, seemed less like time passing than like the house counting itself. Alleyn stood for a moment longer in the quiet that followed departure. He was aware of Mrs. Higgins returning to her pantry, of Davies telephoning the cook to delay supper trays, of Sir Julian rehearsing a narrative without an audience. Miss Marchmont, very straight, had gone to stand at the window and look at the place where the car had not been for some minutes. The evening settled upon Blackwood as the first leaves, stirred by an almost imperceptible wind, detached themselves and fell without sound. "Inspector," Daphne said without turning, "what happens now?" "Now," he answered, and his voice sounded to himself like the last chord after a familiar service. "There will be proper forms. Letters will be written. Mr. Selwyn will advise you, and I will ask Dr. Gresham to see you in the morning. The rest will not be hurried." She nodded. The wordless acceptance of freedom, of loss, lay between them like a length of uncut silk. "Thank you," she said presently, and moved away from the window with an air of someone learning to cross a room she has walked all her life by another path. Alleyn watched her go, and, in the fading light, thought not of victory, but of glass. how it holds, and how, once faulted, it cannot be repaired but only replaced. And even then the cabinet remembers. Morning found Blackwood Manor in a chastened hush, the sort of quiet that follows not merely misfortune but the recognition of its causes. Frost had jeweled the lawns in delicate lattices. From a distance they resembled the pattern a crack makes when it runs through fine glass. Alleyn stood at the window of the morning room, his notes completed, his report to the yard phrased with the economy that grief deserves. Confirmation had arrived before breakfast. Dr. Gresham, chastened and dignified, had telephoned to say that the hospital analysis left little doubt. Digitalis in a concentration no physician would have prescribed, present both in the viscera and in residue on the inside of Lord Ashworth's night glass. Mrs. Higgins, having been requested to set aside yesterday's tea things, had produced the small pot used in Miss Marchmont's room. A slight bitterness in the dregs and a faint chemical odor, easily missed, had prompted a discreet test. The result was consistent with a mild emetic. In the library grate, beneath a bed of grey ash, Davies had discovered a surviving corner of thick paper embossed with a London solicitor's crest, its edges charred but its intention legible. The truth, so carefully dismantled during the night, had left shavings enough for a patient craftsman to reconstruct the shape. Sir Julian called upon Alleyn at 9:30, already booted for town, his countenance arranged with that studied composure which conveys regret without importuning sympathy. "I shall be in London for a few days," he said, his tone deliberately neutral. "There are practical matters. The firm will wish to advise Miss Marchmont at once. If she wishes me to continue as a trustee, under her instruction, of course, I shall do so. If she prefers a complete severance, I shall not take it amiss." "There is, I think," Alleyn returned, his manner as courteous as the others, a grace in departing the stage before one is shown the prompt book. "Miss Marchmont will appreciate that." Sir Julian inclined his head, a small concession to an intimacy neither man would claim. "You must forgive me, Inspector, if I did not see what, evidently, you did." "Sir Julian," Alleyn said, "people do not often see the tyranny of devotion when it is exercised in so refined a manner. You are not required to, and you were, I suspect, encouraged not to." When the baronet had gone, Mrs. Higgins appeared with the domestic accounts and a question distilled from a lifetime's vigilant propriety. "Begging your pardon, sir, if she won't be returning, do you suppose Miss Daphne will wish the household to remain as it is?" "I think," Alleyn said, "Miss Marchmont will choose what she wishes at last. But if she is as sensible as she appears, she will value those who have kept the house from falling to pieces, quietly and without remark." Mrs. Higgins's composed mouth softened for a fraction of a second. "We did try, sir." She hesitated, then added, with that scrupulous honesty which is the servant's hallmark, "I noticed the shepherdess yesterday, only a hair's breadth out. I dust around her base on Fridays. I thought, well, perhaps Madam had moved her herself." "That was a reasonable thought," Alleyn said. "One seldom expects danger to travel by such delicate routes." He found Miss Marchmont in the little study at the back of the house, an austere room with a view of espaliered pears embracing a brick wall. She had before her the leather portfolio Lady Selina had indicated the night before, its meticulous lists and careful maps of domestic routine laid open like a chart of another person's mind. She looked up with a steadiness he had not seen in her eyes until now. "I telephoned the solicitors," she said. "They are sending duplicates. It seems one can reconstitute almost anything if one has the will to do it. Except—" She stopped and arranged the papers with a gentleness that was not uncertainty so much as respect for the weight of things. "Except what one imagined one's life had been. Nothing is quite lost," Alleyn said, "but one must decide what to keep." After a moment she smiled, the smallest possible sign of complicity between two people who understood that sentiment had limits. "I shall keep Mrs. Higgins and Davies, and the gardener. He understands the pears. As for the rest, I shall see." At the door, she paused, her hand resting on the frame. "Inspector, do you believe my aunt loved me?" "I think," Alleyn replied, "she loved you in the manner that suited her best. There are loves that set people free and loves that build very beautiful cages. It is sometimes difficult, from inside, to tell the difference." She inclined her head as if acknowledging a verdict and returned to her portfolio, to her lists, to a life that would be hers at last because it would, finally, be chosen. Davies met Alleyn in the corridor and, with that tact which is the butler's art, led him to the small glass-fronted cabinet in the dining room. The Venetian goblets had been restored to order, their pearly sheen untroubled, their fragility an open secret. On the lowest shelf lay a shallow tray on which Davies had placed the shards from the broken glass, each fragment washed and dried, as if even in ruin the thing deserved a decent ceremony. "Shall I have them taken away, sir?" he asked. "Not yet," Alleyn said. "Leave them for a day or two. There is a lesson in broken glass that cannot be taught by an empty shelf." Outside, the gardener's broom whispered across the terrace, gathering the smallest glints left from another, more literal shattering. Alleyn took his hat and coat from the stand and, in the doorway, looked back at the quiet rooms in which so much care had been exercised for so long. Care can nourish and it can smother. The line between the two is fine as dust and just as easily displaced. As the car turned down the drive, the house receded into a composition of planes and windows, a stately facade remade by what it had contained. He thought of the shepherdess and the key hidden in her base, of the brandy glass, the exactness of the desk, the punctual fire in the library, of a goblet shattered in the midst of elegant talk. It had needed very little to show where the pattern had been strained. One misaligned habit, one precaution too many, one quiet act of love transformed by fear into violence. By the lodge gates, a thin sun broke through the mist and laid a pale brightness across the frost, so that the lawns glittered not like wounds, but like new glass, whole and unbroken. Alleyn, who had seen many houses learning, in their separate ways, to breathe again after disaster, did not mistake it for redemption, but he allowed the image to stand, as one allows a good lie to live when it harms no one and helps the living to go on. Blackwood Manor diminished behind him. Ahead lay London, reports, the sober privacy of the yard. He settled into the rhythm of the road and, with his usual economy, put the case aside. Some fractures, he reflected, run along lines invisible until the moment they break. The rest of us, arriving after the sound, can only trace the pattern and, if we are fortunate, leave the pieces where their lesson can be seen.